There are moments in history when a single event doesn't just change policy, it begins to rewrite entire alliances. Moments when nations suddenly realize the world they relied on for decades no longer exists in the form they once believed it did. We may be living through one of those moments right now, and strangely enough, it began not with a war, not with an invasion, but with a chair at a table in Armenia. Last week, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked into a room in Yerevan where he was never supposed to be sitting, not because he was unwelcome, but because Canada simply is not a European country, and yet there he was. Not as an observer, not as a guest, but as a full participant at the European Political Community Summit, a gathering historically reserved for European states and their closest political partners. Most of the world barely noticed. The story was buried beneath headlines about tariffs, markets, elections, and geopolitical chaos. But historians may eventually look back at that summit as the moment the Western alliance system quietly began to transform, because what happened in Armenia was not symbolic diplomacy, it was a signal that Canada is beginning to reposition itself away from the United States and toward Europe. To understand why that matters, we need to understand what is actually changing beneath the surface. Because this is not just about one summit or one speech. This is about NATO, about defense independence, about trade, about the collapse of assumptions that governed the Western world for nearly 80 years. For decades, the relationship between Canada and the United States was considered one of the strongest partnerships on Earth. Shared borders, shared wars, shared economies, shared infrastructure. Most people assumed the relationship was permanent, untouchable. But in March 2025, something changed. Donald Trump announced sweeping new tariffs on imported automobiles, including vehicles coming from Canada and Mexico, countries that had long operated under free trade agreements with the United States. For many Americans, it looked like another aggressive economic policy. But in Ottawa, it triggered something much deeper. For the first time in generations, Canada began seriously considering the possibility that dependence on the United States could become a strategic vulnerability. Mark Carney understood that immediately. And that matters because Carney is not a traditional politician. He is an economist, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, a man who spent decades studying financial crises, economic leverage, and systemic risk. He recognized something many Western leaders were still trying to ignore, that under Trump, economic interdependence was increasingly being used as a political weapon. And so Canada began to move, quietly, methodically, strategically. Since taking office, Carney has made 5 major trips to Europe and only 1 brief visit to Washington. That is not random diplomacy, that is doctrine. In June 2025, Canada signed a major strategic partnership agreement with the European Union focused on trade, technology, energy, and defense cooperation. At the same time, Ottawa began actively building alternative supply chains and alternative economic relationships outside direct American influence. But the real shock came in defense policy. Canada officially joined SAFE, the massive European defense initiative designed to help Europe rearm independently of Washington. And with that decision, Canada became the first non-European nation ever allowed into Europe's new military-industrial framework. Think about how extraordinary that is. A founding NATO member, a country historically integrated into the American military system at almost every level, is now investing directly into European strategic autonomy. That does not happen accidentally. Carney also announced that more than 70 cents of every Canadian defense dollar would no longer go toward American contractors. That is a massive shift. For decades, Canadian military procurement flowed almost automatically into the US defense industry. Now Canada is trying to reduce that dependency. And at the core of all this lies one uncomfortable question. What happens if the United States is no longer a reliable ally? That is the real issue here. Carney is not anti-American. That distinction matters. Canada is not leaving NATO, it is not abandoning NORAD. It is not formally breaking with Washington. But what Carney is doing is arguably more significant than any dramatic rupture. He is trying to reduce Canada's strategic dependence on American political stability. For decades, Ottawa operated under the assumption that no matter who occupied the White House, the United States would remain fundamentally predictable. That assumption no longer feels guaranteed, and Europe is arriving at the exact same conclusion. Inside NATO, discussions are now happening that would have sounded absurd just a few years ago. European governments are quietly exploring contingency plans for scenarios in which the United States scales back its security commitments. Informal conversations about independent European command structures, deterrence systems, and long-term defense autonomy are no longer theoretical. That is historically unprecedented. NATO was built around one central idea: permanent American leadership in European security. But now even some of America's closest allies are preparing for a future where that leadership may become conditional. That is why the Armenia summit mattered so much. The European political community does not produce major treaties or binding agreements. It is primarily a political club, a symbolic institution, a signal of who belongs inside the broader European political family. By inviting Canada, Europe sent a message to the world. Canada increasingly belongs in that family. And Carney made the message even clearer during his speech. He declared that the international order could potentially be rebuilt out of Europe. He spoke about the importance of reliable partners, and he warned that middle powers must work together because countries that are not at the table eventually end up on the menu. That is not normal diplomatic language. That is strategic language for a world entering a new era of geopolitical instability. Meanwhile, Canada itself is transforming faster than almost anyone expected. Defense spending is surging. Ottawa is no longer simply aiming for NATO's 2% spending target. It has committed itself to a long-term trajectory toward 5% of GDP by 2035. A level of military investment that would sounded completely unrealistic only a few years ago. Billions are now flowing into Arctic defense, cyber warfare, domestic manufacturing, military modernization, and new procurement programs. Canada is attempting to achieve 3 goals simultaneously: build an independent defense industrial base, integrate itself into European defense supply chains, and reduce long-term dependency on American military systems. That is not a temporary reaction anymore. That is geopolitical restructuring. But the situation remains deeply complicated. Because no matter how ambitious Carney's European pivot becomes, Canada is still economically tied to the United States in ways that cannot be undone overnight. The overwhelming majority of Canadian exports still go south. American infrastructure, capital, energy networks, and consumers remain deeply woven into the Canadian economy. Carney understands that perfectly well, which is why he is not trying to destroy the relationship with Washington. He is trying to hedge against it, to create alternatives without triggering a complete rupture. That is what makes his strategy so sophisticated. Canada cannot escape geography, but it may be trying to escape strategic overdependence, and that may be the single biggest transformation happening in the Western Alliance today. For generations, Canada viewed itself primarily as part of a North American system led by the United States. Now Ottawa increasingly sees itself as a transatlantic middle power balancing between America and Europe. The implications are enormous. For NATO, it means political gravity may slowly be shifting away from Washington and toward Europe. For Europe, it means strategic autonomy is no longer just a French talking point. It is becoming institutional reality. And for the United States, it means even its most loyal allies are beginning to prepare for a world in which American reliability can no longer be automatically assumed. That is why the image from Armenia matters. The image of the Canadian Prime Minister sitting among European leaders represented something larger than one summit. It represented the possibility of a new Western alignment emerging in real time. And perhaps that is the deepest truth here. World orders rarely collapse all at once. They erode gradually. Through tariffs, through procurement decisions, through diplomatic invitations, through small symbolic moments that seem insignificant in isolation, until suddenly they form a pattern too obvious to ignore. That is what may be happening now. Canada is making a historic choice. Not loudly, not dramatically, but step by step. More European integration, more defense independence, more strategic diversification. And perhaps, years from now, historians will look back at that chair in Yerevan as the moment the Western Alliance quietly began to become something entirely different.